Now I will show you how to knit this headband for children. These are made to match the neck warmer I made earlier. But here you have several options when it comes to design. I have chosen to make the ribbing knit 2 and purl 2. You can do knit 1, purl 1, for example. And here in the middle you can just knit, or you can do moss stitching, or whatever you want really. And of course you can choose whatever color you like. I will use a short circular knitting needle size 3.5 millimeters, and I will use a yarn that will give 22 stitches for every 10 centimeters or 4 inches when using the same size knitting needle. So I will begin to cast on by making a slip knot, and I put it onto my knitting needle, and there I have my first stitch. So now I want my cast on to be really elastic, and then I just secure the first stitch on the needle here with my left hand, and with my right hand I use my index finger and I go from below and I bring the yarn up and I twist so that I get a loop around my index finger. I take my knitting needle and I place it on top of the yarn, and I move down to the tip of my index finger, up through the loop, and I just slip it onto the knitting needle. I go up and twist, knitting needle on top and down to the tip of my index finger, through the loop, and I slip it onto the knitting needle, and I just repeat until I have the number of stitches that I want. I make sure that I do not cast on too tight, because then I will have trouble when I knit the first row. It will be difficult to pick up the stitches, so not too tight. I have now finished the cast on and I have begun to knit the first row, and I knit ribbing, and I knit 2, purl 2, knit 2 and purl 2, as you can see. So what I do is that when I knit, I take my right knitting needle and I stick it through the stitch, down and up. I move the knitting needle to the tip of my index finger and down behind the yarn, and then I just pull the yarn through the stitch and slip it off the needle. So again, up through the stitch to the tip of my index finger and down behind the yarn. I pull the yarn through the stitch and I slip it off the needle. And when I purl, I go the opposite way. I start at the tip of my index finger, I move down behind the yarn, and I go up through the stitch from my far side, and then I go back behind the yarn and pull it through the stitch and slip it off the needle. So have to move the stitches a bit. It's a bit tight on the first row. This will become much better when you have knitted a couple rows. So again, when I purl, I start at the tip of my index finger, I move behind my yarn and up through the stitch, behind the yarn again, and then I pull the yarn through my stitch and I slip it onto my knitting needle. and I just keep going. I make sure not to pull too much on my right knitting needle, because then I will create a gap here. This is because of the way I cast on. And this is also the reason why it becomes very elastic when you are done knitting, because the stitches can all easily move here. So if I pull on my right knitting needle, there you can see I get a much larger gap. If you have done so, you just mend it by knitting your next stitch a bit carefully, and you make sure you do not pull. Then you can see my gap is a bit smaller. Now I will purl, and I will make sure again not to pull, and you can see now my gap is almost gone already. So I will continue to knit my ribbing. I will do 2 rows of this color, and I will do 2 rows in a different color, and I'll change for every 2 rows so that my ribbing will become stripy. I'm now finished knitting my ribbing. Here I have added some gray stripes, and now I will begin on the next step, and then I will knit 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches, and I will purl the 5th stitch, and I will repeat. I knit 1, 2, 3, 4 stitches, and I purl the next. And I will continue to do so throughout this row, and I will do the next rows in the same way. I will knit over the knitted stitches, and I will purl over the purled stitch. Now my pink part here is about the same width as the ribbing with stripes, and I will now repeat this part here so that I get another ribbing with stripes on this side. So then I have just started my row here, so I will continue, and I will knit 2 and purl 2 throughout the row, and I'll continue to do so. 2 stripes of pink, 2 rows of pink, 2 rows of gray, 2 pink, 2 gray, until I have the same length as this one. Now I have done my second striped ribbing, and I have begun to cast off. And what I do at the beginning is that I knit 2 stitches like this. I make sure I do not knit too tightly, because then my cast off will be a bit unelastic. So I knit a bit loose to make sure I get some elasticity to it. So when I have knitted 2 stitches, I take the first one and I slip it over the other like this. Then I knit another stitch, take the last one and slip it over. And here where I have purl stitches, I continue to purl them, and I do it the same way through the entire row. And when I am finished and I only have 1 stitch like this, I cut my yarn here and I just pull it through this loop, and then I fasten, so fasten the yarn, and then the headband is finished.